In a mellow tone, feeling fancy free, and I'm not alone. I've got company, everything's okay. The livelong day with this mellow song, I can't go wrong. In a mellow tone, that's the way to live. If you hope and know, something's got to give. Just blow your way and laugh and play. There's joy unknown in a mellow tone. Got a bed down, go by. Oh, I sing in a mellow tone, and I'm fancy free. I've got my company. Everything is okay. The livelong day with this mellow song, I will go wrong. In a mellow tone, that's the way to live. If you hope and grow, something's got to give. Just blow your way and laugh and play. There's joy unknown in a mellow tone. Yeah, there's joy unknown. Oh, in a mellow tone. There's joy unknown in a mellow tone. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our webinar.
Love it.
Host, but I'm going to hand it over to our fabulous host, Celine.
I love that you can bang out a scat before 10 o'clock in the morning. That was amazing.
This is usually my practice.
So good.
Morning piano. And it usually is at 8, like whenever all the kids go to school and before the day starts. But yeah.
Oh, so good.
Yeah.
What a way to start. Thank you so much, Corina. I feel very energetic now, so I definitely don't need another coffee for today. Thank you. I would like to say a big welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today for our first 2022 Let's Talk About webinar. I am Veronica, Diversity and Inclusion Partner at Innovate UK KTN and Program Lead for the Women in Innovation Award. The Let's Talk About webinar series started in 2020 with the aim to drive powerful conversations, share stories, and provide inspirational advice from women and male allies at the heart of the discussion. We've delivered 12 sessions so far between 2020 and 2021, and today we are continuing the amazing legacy we have by talking about the power of storytelling. As we all know, navigating the entrepreneurial ecosystem takes courage, resilience, the ability to reinvent oneself, a growth mindset, embracing one's vulnerability, and so much more. And it also requires storytelling, and we will hear more about it today with our amazing speakers. They are all storytellers in their beautiful ways. Before I quickly introduce them, I would like to mention that the feel of the discussion is aimed to be conversational, warm, friendly, and open. It is not a dedicated Q&A session, but we want you to be part of the discussion. Thus, we will have the Q&A and the chat functions available for any comments, impressions, or questions you might want to share. As I can see, you've already added different comments and in the chat, so thank you so much for that. So if necessary, you can enable live subtitles using the closed captioning function available. So that's always a good to have. It is now my pleasure to mention our wonderful speakers, Solène Anglaret, Diversity and Inclusion Partner at Innovate UK KTN and Program Lead for the Young Innovators Award, who will be moderating the discussion today. Dr. Corina Shikakwami, Associate Director of Strategy at Purpose, who you've just heard doing her performance, and Sam Drew Jones, founder and stylist at the Copy Salon. Solène, over to you to start the conversation, and thank you so much all. Enjoy it fully.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Veronica, for the kind introduction. And Corina, wow, what a way to start. I could see in the chat many people saying, oh, I wish all my meetings started like that. I completely agree with all of you. I wish the same. So maybe we need to link up with Corina and have her start all of our meetings. So like Veronica said, my name is Solène Anglaret. I'm a D&I partner at Innovate UK KTN. I look after the Young Innovators program, which helps young people from 18 to 30 to turn their idea into a business reality. I'm also the founder of Be Beyond Borders. I'm a host of a talk show called The Inclusion Conversation. I'm the author of a few books, 4 to date, all around the topics of identity, home, and belonging. And I'm also an aspiring artist, I would say. I just enjoy creating art. And so I hosted an art and poetry exhibition a couple of years ago. I absolutely love to travel. That's where I get a lot of my inspiration. I've lived in 6 countries and traveled to more than 50. It's only a quarter of the world, so there's a lot more to explore. Storytelling for me is at the heart of everything that I do, and it really underpins my lifelong commitment to breaking down borders and bringing the world closer together, one story, one conversation at a time. So thank you so much for joining us today. I'm honestly so grateful and honored to be your moderator, and especially because I get to have the most amazing conversation, and I'm setting it up here, but it is going to be with 2 incredible panelists and guests today. So I'd love to hand over to you now to just do a short introduction of yourself. So Sam, what about starting with you? Tell us a bit about you, and also include what storytelling means. What does it mean? What does it mean to you?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. I too come from a music background, spent my whole childhood and teenage years creating songs at the piano, and did a degree in music in London. And I think storytelling is so baked into music, and with it, in the middle of my 20s, I learned that actually I was working with a lot of my artist friends to help them understand their stories, and doing what I then realized a couple of years later was actually marketing, taking their photos, helping them build their websites, telling the stories behind their art. And it took me down a road that led to working with startups to do the same. I realized those same formulas can be applied in any style of business. And now I work with a company called 64 Million Artists. They are helping everybody to ignite their creativity across the UK. And I also work in my own business, the Coffee Salon, in which I help founders that are just starting out or that are trying to rebrand or tell their story in a new way to understand how to do that. What's your voice? Let's understand your tone of voice, and let's tell this in an authentic way. So yeah, I still do music, I still write songs, and absolutely loved Karina's performance. That was so good. And I suppose storytelling for me is, I think it helps us to understand who we are in the world and how we relate to each other. And I always think that when we tell a story, we trigger something which I like to call CPR. It's either connection, perplexion, or rejection. And hopefully today we will trigger connection.
I love that. I love that. CPR. I'll take a note of that. Corina, what about you? Would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about storytelling and what it means to you?
Yeah, happy to. And it's funny because I can't see everybody, but I have this energy right now that I kind of want to jump up and down. And I think stories for me, actually, they ignite something of like being like 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years old. And I think the stories that really caught me as a small child, actually, there's elements of them that still completely today are the same. So I will introduce myself. I'm Karina Kwame. Actually, in this space, I'm going to introduce myself as the granddaughter of 2 incredible women. My grandmother, Margaret Kite, Irish woman, came to the US. And my father's mother, Ghanaian woman, she never actually ever left Ghana. And I always think about their stories and journeys because my grandmother never could read. My father's mother, she was taken out of school very young to look after her siblings and made sure that her kids were all educated and that they could all speak, read, write, both in English and in their mother tongue, which is Ewe. My mother's mother was extremely educated. She went on to do a master's in the 50s, and she worked in intelligence in Washington. And honestly, she left that career. She had 10 children, one of them being my mother. And again, always encouraged us grandchildren to be telling each other stories. So there's all the academic work, there's the music, there's the studies, but the way that she talked about her life and her growth, there's so much power in being able to articulate your story. And for me, I see myself as somebody working at the intersection of the arts and sciences. I started off, immigrant's child, very much doctor, lawyer, disgrace to the family was sort of the mantra. But I did feel my parents really supported me to embrace different ways of telling stories. And so grew up with a lot of music in the house, had never really connected it to my vocation until maybe the last couple of years, to be honest. I kept those worlds very separate because the stories didn't actually come together in a way that felt authentic to me. But the short story is worked in public health, was really interested in what makes a city move, what makes people have places and spaces that they can thrive in. So the building blocks, water, transport, electricity, but then all the things that make small businesses thrive are absolutely the things that attract people to come to those cities. So moved into infrastructure, but then realized there's a huge gap, and it's something that Sam's work is really looking at, is how do you actually tell your story when you are interacting in those spaces. So cities are my home, but regardless of what industry or sector you're in, being able to tell your story and reach the audience that you're trying to reach is a huge part of doing that well. So at Purpose, that's very much the heart of what we do. When I started working at Purpose, I really did see that marriage of the two. The storytelling is an art as well as a science. There is different ways that you can do that. So I'll be sharing a bit as we go through. I'm realizing I'm going on a tangent, but I'm feeling in a very camaraderie, vulnerable space. So you're going to get a lot of family, I can see already in this conversation. Yeah, happy to talk with everybody who does intercultural, cross-sectoral collaborations.
And that's one of the powers of stories, isn't it? Being that bridge intercultural, inter disciplines, inter everything, right? And touching on that, you said stories are really powerful. You both mentioned it. What if we were to boil it down to what is the power of story in, a few words, or maybe an example? What are maybe is the power, or what are the powers? Is there more than one power?
I think storytelling is so powerful. The stories we tell ourselves, the stories we tell each other. I think if you're here, you've understood that storytelling isn't a wishy-washy thing. As humans, we're programmed for stories. And like neuroscientists have been saying for years that neurons that fire together wire together. So the stories that we tell you know, we're looking for connection with people, and it doesn't always happen. You know, we've all got that aunt or uncle that will tell story after story after story after story, and it's not landing at all. Not all stories land, but I think that it's so important to remember that stories help everyone to remember things about you, and they help people to care about what you're doing, especially in a business sense. Someone I find really interesting when it comes to storytelling actually is Darren Brown. I think you only have to listen to him talk about the power of NLP and how we can be so manipulated with regards to decisions that we make, buying wise, well, up to anything. I mean, his documentaries are quite incredible, the things that he can convince people to do. And I find it really interesting, the work he does around replicating what faith healers do. And I really respect him picking away. He picks everything apart and really helps you understand how we can be swayed one way or another by language and suggestion. So I think there is great power in story, and it's up to us to put it to good use.
Yeah, wow. And I love I'm actually going to look up some of his stuff because I haven't listened to it. But I think there's two fronts. I think, well, two fronts I'll name. There's sort of the individual personal story. And I think, you know, when you look back at your journey and where you've been, the people you've met, the things that stick out are often the hook for the story. So you think of that person who, you know, made a connection and, you know, helped you get into the position you're in now, or, you know, an experience that completely changed you, either failing at something, but then really realizing this is a turning point for me. And then I just think about personally, like, and I'm probably going to get very, very vulnerable, like when you're at the end of that journey, you know, what are the things that stick out to you? And for me, it's always, you know, friends, family, you know, key moments in music. I can't think of anything else that sort of provides the color of one's life. Now I say that with like an individual piece, because when we tell other people's story, we have that level of intimacy. So then it becomes the power of telling stories, the power of amplifying, of, you know, making sure people's stories are getting told. So that's sort of on the individual and personal front. I think in terms of like collective stories we tell ourselves, this is where I think a lot of the power sits. And I would almost say, and this is to use some work from Pop Culture Collab, who describes sort of narrative change as like, think of the ocean as like lots of droplets, and those are all the stories, but the actual power of the currents of the ocean, that's narrative. So there are narratives that we're so used to hearing, i.e. the founder who like really, you know, did so many pitches, went to so many different investors, you know, really struggled and like really, you know, came out of the end with like the lights shining and the sun opening. But actually, I find that story is the one we're used to hearing. Like the story of like a gazillion no's, actually thinking I'm going to quit, you know, late nights crying with family. Like those are the kind of things that like, that's not in the narrative. And as a musician as well, like you're used to seeing 10% of the performance, the limelight, you know, the makeup, the traveling, the festivals, etc. But actually 90% is like not glamorous, but it's that 90% where you build all those relationships that actually get you to where you are. So I like to think of, you know, the power of stories is when we can shift narratives. And we can think about this in different countries, cultures, whatever. But I think having those two levers, the individual personal one, knowing your journey where it sits in the big ocean of the collective narrative. Mm-hmm.
And we love a happy ending, don't we? We love the Hollywood style story. So it's like we want to hear the struggle, but only if there's going to be like a light at the end of the tunnel, it seems. Anyway, in that world of entrepreneurship that you described, indeed, we're often, you know, even ourselves, right? Innovate UK KTN. I can think of a lot of success stories that we put out there, which are all about, yeah, it was tough, but, you know, here's how I came through. So let's touch on that then, the link between startup, business, stories. What is the place of story in the startup journey? At different stages of the startup journey. What do you think?
Sam, I think you got this one first.
I think it's really important to document as you go. So I think, from the very beginning, we can underestimate the small stories that might be really poignant later on. Like I've tended to document along the way, like when I started the copy salon, sometimes just for my own sanity of like to go back and see how far you've come. But there are little details in there that can really be baked in later on. Yeah, I think there are so many stories to tell really when it comes to startup world. And I think when sharing your story on social as well, and even on LinkedIn, I think there's a real space for people to be more vulnerable on LinkedIn. It's such a it has for such a long time been such a dry place where so many people are there, especially business to business. It's a real key place for you to carve out your story and be a bit more vulnerable and share pull that curtain back and tell the stories behind the scenes that are going on. And I think it's really important to not shy away from sharing those stories about failure. You only have to listen to Elizabeth Day's How to Fail podcast to know how compelling it is to hear how so many people haven't, hit the ground running.
Definitely. And I would say, obviously, not necessarily in the founder space, but actually, as a musician, you're like a perpetual founder building your brand. I try to think of understanding what's the dominant way we tell stories, because I think there is something about pitching in like brackets that I don't like. And there is an element of, there's the challenge and the pain point, and then you're going to go into a bit of the context, what other people are doing, where your solution is going to fix everything, and then like now you're going to buy it. So for folks who like know sales and marketing, or who like study, even the mechanics of how you build a pitch, I find the pitches that always strike me are the ones that depart from that, but they still know who their audience is. So it's not like I'm going to go play a gig for 45 minutes, when actually I know that audience only needs like a minute and then they need to see other people. But I do feel like there is a dominant way of telling a story that's very linear. And that is what I try to get away from. And I see, that can be confusing. Also culturally, I mean, my father's family, my other half is Ghanaian. And the way that we tell stories and the way that even humor is used is very different than it is in the UK or in the US. Like, for instance, my sisters we would joke that, the humor of dad's side of the family is like lots of repetition. So you'll hear a story or a joke like 6 times and like it's getting funnier and funnier, but goodness gracious, I remember this 25 years later. So the stories that stick and the way that we can embrace different ways of storytelling, different structures of storytelling. As a jazz musician, you still want to have structure that allows you to improvise, i.e. go on tangents, but within a framework, or within a structure. And that to me is where the exciting part of pitches, I think, can come. And even just getting away from that language of pitching, to be honest, I think we need to get to more like, I'm inviting you to go on this journey with me, or I'm creating a space where we can have a conversation. There's different ways to do it. And I think that actually would be a little bit more refreshing to see on platforms like LinkedIn, or not even just virtual. I'm also getting more excited about things that can be in person if it's appropriate and safe.
I think there's an element there as well of understanding which direction everyone's going in and how can you go in the opposite direction. How can you go left when everyone else is going right? How many times have we been to conferences and seen PowerPoint presentations that totally steal your complete interest away from the story that the person's telling? You start reading those bullet points, you start looking at the GIFs or the pictures or whatever they've put behind them. The most interesting story I ever got from a conference was when somebody actually was asked to come up last minute, and she had no slides, no preparation. She was just asked to get up and tell her story, and the whole room was gripped. There was no distraction behind her. There was no structured element to it. And I think there's real power there in just knowing that you can just get up and tell your story. And I know it takes I think it takes confidence to tell your story, but I think it's something that we've all got the ability to do. You know, we've all got value, and we just have to really believe that we've got stories worth sharing.
Totally.
It's terrifying though, because back to the image that you shared, Karina, of the currents and the ocean going, swimming against the current is absolutely terrifying. It brings that fear. So how do you find, I don't know if it's a balance, or I don't know if you just decide that, you know what, I'm going to do my own thing, and or do you go, I'm going to try and harness the currents and kind of use them to my advantage? How do you navigate the push and pull between those two things? Or I suppose being part of the collective story, leveraging it to your advantage, being on social media, telling, following, doing, what is it now, TikTok and all the new things, and at the same time doing your own thing in your own way and going against the common narrative.
Well, I think it's really, and it's about strategy. But I also would say and repeat, obviously, storytelling is an art as well as a science. So I think there's a question of like, what is your end game? But knowing that storytelling and narrative change work is a long game, what are sort of the interim milestones that you want to get to? Is it just to reach a new audience? Is it to connect with an audience that that is very close to you? Which actually prompts me to think, putting yourself in the receiving end, like how are we set up to receive stories? Because certain formats and structures might not be set up to receive your story in the way it should be. And we know this. There's lots of great stories that maybe happened 10 years ago, but actually now is the moment when people are ready to hear it. I think whether it's thinking about climate, whether it's thinking about Black Lives Matter and the context that was in 2020, those stories have been ongoing for a very long time. But I don't think the countries were in a position to receive them. And actually thinking about 2022, we're in a different place to receive those stories. So I think it's strategy in the sense of where are people at and where are you going to meet them? But then what are those key moments? This is something Purpose thinks about a lot. It's like not just building events and campaigns around key moments, but like how do you leverage key moments strategically? And I'm not saying that in sort of a clinical way. It's like there's a lot of effort that goes into people's stories. There's a lot of like ethical concerns when you put people's stories on display. So how are you ensuring that they are set up in a way to be received in a way that's authentic to them? So I actually, when thinking about your question, would say, if you put yourself in the seat of the audience, like how are they set up to receive stories? Because my decision, push or pull, is much more about, I'm thinking, 4 or 5 steps down the road, what is my objective? Whereas I might be just playing on deaf ears. So there's an element of, you want and I, as a musician, we do this almost intuitively. You will have a set list, a list of songs, a mix of originals, some covers, some improvisational pieces. And when you're in a room watching the audience respond, we might not do that ballad now, or we might not do that call and response interactive piece until I know, like intuitively, that people are ready for that. There might be points where I push them, but we've all been at a gig where you're being constantly pushed and you're like, I'm just going to go over here and come back in a bit. So there's that element too of being able to pivot, adjust, improvise in real time, which there's that is an art. That is most definitely an art.
I think that being a musician first definitely helps with regards to having that balance of reading the room when you're pitching to investors and your peers as well. I think, it's really important to know and be able to shift. It is definitely an art. It's really interesting because Becky Lodge has just said in the chat that it's often easier to get somebody else to tell your story, because as a founder, like getting stuff out of your head is critical and it can help with your well-being. And I do think it's really interesting how so in the copy salon, instead of asking people to send me their story in Word format, I interview people on Zoom. Because I find that people talk about themselves in such a different way, like we do today, when it's not scripted and it's not written down, and it's there's chance for you to open up and tell those stories that you might not have thought to say, or somebody can ask you a question that might send you off on a beautiful tangent that becomes the crux of the story. And I didn't really mean to do that with people. I'm dyslexic, and even though I'm a copywriter, a lot of people might think those two come head to head. But my issue with dyslexia was actually short-term memory loss. So with people sending me stories written down, it's not always going to stick in my mind. So I interview people on Zoom because I can record it. But I realized through doing that with people that they do just come out with these amazing candid expressions about themselves and their businesses that really must be used. And also it's much easier, especially with small businesses, to hear their tone of voice when we speak on video. And I find it's really good, I think, to have a discussion with somebody and tell your story via video or in person first to see what interests them.
Absolutely.
It's really interesting. You're both touching on, I think, two aspects of stories. One is the receiving end, so the audience, who's hearing the message, what are they hearing, and how do we kind of position also the story that it can be received and held by someone. But then also the fact that the story comes from within. And so being authentic and being vulnerable and being open to sharing that story, you have to know that story first, right? You need to go within and find that story, because sometimes we just have so many different stories up here. But what is the core? What is the underpinning authenticity? And I think when you shared, Sam, just now about your dyslexia and the challenges around that, I felt it deep in the body. And I think that's what we do with these stories when they come from within, rather than, okay, there's something coming up and I think the audience want to hear that. And so it's I suppose, how do we find a way to marry the two, that what comes from within will echo and resonate and be received and helpful, valuable for the audience that is hearing it. So it's kind of like dancing. And you've touched on also music, obviously. So can we explore that a little bit more? Because I love that you both have a background in music. So what do you think are the links and the joining points between stories, music, dance?
I mean, I'm sure, Karina, you've got loads to say on this as well. But I think for me, songwriting is therapy. And it's the way that I really help myself understand what I'm going through. And it's a way of, my brain goes into a different gear than it does when I'm talking, than when I'm singing and writing a melody about how I'm feeling. It's really quite incredible how you can come out with things and be like, wow, that's how I'm feeling today. Okay, I didn't realize that. I think it can work in a similar way when you do something called the morning pages. Anybody who's read the brilliant book, The Artist's Way, I think it's incredible to sit down and do a stream of consciousness and just sit there and write. Don't judge yourself, just keep writing. So if you're not a musician, I think this is a good way to unpick your story and understand more about yourself. Is to just keep writing and writing, set a timer for 15 to 30 minutes and see what comes out on the page. That you'll have a lot more to say than you think you can. And if you think you can't, you've got nothing to say, try doing the morning pages and you will surprise yourself. But I think that, when we listen to songs, we've all heard that song on the radio in which we thought, oh my God, they're singing about me. This is my situation. When we've had our heart broken and a sad song comes on the radio, and then suddenly you think it triggers feelings of connection and nostalgia rather than sadness. You're listening to someone sing about heartbreak, but you're feeling connection and nostalgia. And I think it can help mitigate feelings of meaningless and reduce anxiety in all of us to share our stories, even through music. I think there's a lot that we can do to really, it's amazing how we can push and pull people's emotions with regards to music as well. But yeah, Karina, I'm really intrigued to hear what you have to say about this.
My brain is firing up. I'm like, there's so many angles we could go in. But okay, so just embrace that there might be a few different directions. Okay, I would say fundamentally, I wouldn't even separate music and dance. Um, and this is gonna, for the musicians, tap dancers in the audience, this is gonna fire up, so many different things. But I was as a practicing jazz musician, I would say when I think about rhythm, time, and feel, I'm thinking about whether it's the piano or singing or dancing, what is the groove that's going to allow all the instruments, all of the audience, and I work primarily with dancers. What is the groove that's actually going to bring all those folks into community? And I say community in the sense we're all in the same we're all in the same feel. Um, and I say that because the origins of jazz, I would say for folks who are new to that art form or learned musicians, there's a lot of different influences, but at no point was dance ever separated until very recent, maybe in the last 50, 60 years. And I say that with early 1600s, slaves being brought to the United States, being separated from common languages, common cultures by design. So folks couldn't, speak the same language. They couldn't practice their religion. And actually, in the early days, particularly in New Orleans, we have accounts of people being brought into spaces where the only thing that they could do was dance together. In many cases, weren't even allowed to play their own instruments. So when we talk about the history of jazz and particularly Black American dances, tap in particular becomes one that is like the fundamental backbone for a lot of the jazz dances we have because of that history of repression, but also revolution. And when I say revolution, because when we think about jazz, it is about freedom and that ability to completely improvise within a very rigid structure. And jazz has never been separate from the politics of its time. So if you look at the history of jazz from what I was talking about in the early 1600s, 1800s, we have Congo Square in the 1900s. This is that space where people were brought in New Orleans, slaves were brought to dance. And then through the 19 teens, 30s, we see, the evolution of the Charleston, the Roaring 20s, the 30s, very much, the beginning of the big bands, but also the Great Migration. So people after the end of slavery, end of 1800s, going everywhere. We're talking Kansas, Pittsburgh, New York, Chicago. So that wasn't linear. That was just like, if you imagine a map of one, probably the largest movement of voluntary people in the Americas going all over the country. And with them, they brought their dances, they brought their culture, but again, stripped of those languages and religions that their ancestors had. So for me, tap dance, and particularly tap, is like a reminder of that. And when we think about the stories that are not told, dance for me becomes the conversation that heals. And so as a dancer, I work a lot with Lindy Hop, if you're familiar with partner dance. This also has another history and another story that is continuing, well into 2022. There are Lindy Hop communities around the world wrestling with this concept of, this is a dance that came out of a very particular context and evolved in different ways. So for me, there's a conversation that heals. It's also celebration. And I think this is another thing of joy, that regardless of the situation that we find ourselves in, can always find joy in that place. So for me, I don't separate them at all, but I also want to just name, particularly for folks working in the innovation space, infrastructure, cities, planning, there's some great work that Ellie Cosgrave did called Choreographing the City. And this was a work of thinking about how do we actually bring choreographers, dancers together with engineers and planners to think about how people navigate space. So think about a train station. Why are they designed a certain way? That there's thought, there's structure, there's science to it. But if we bring other perspectives, i.e. dancers, how we use a space, how we connect with each other in an ensemble, how we connect if we're soloing, how do we work with a band if we're a tap dancer. There's just so much, and there's so much wealth of how we design inclusive spaces with a practice that is absolutely grounded in healing. So yeah, I could totally go on. This is not like a dance monologue, but
Great.
I wish I had my tap board.
It's a great reminder that, I think a lot of the time when we hear stories, we think about once upon a time, we think about maybe words and books. And I think it's a great reminder that music, dance, arts in all different forms, and even just being, the energy that we each hold, all of that, there's story in that, there's telling in that because we are exchanging messages, we're exchanging energies in the process. And I loved your point about creating community. I want to go from that with like a very probably bizarre transition, but I'm just feeling like
do it.
Go from big to bring it back within. The first person we tell stories to, whether we sing them, dance them, live them, speak them, write them, is ourselves. And there's been a bit of activity in the chat around that. So I want to pick up on that. Yeah, I mean, we talk to ourselves all the time. When we're kids, I don't know what point we realize that we all do it. I always wonder that, we probably need someone with a background in neuroscience to kind of answer my question. I'm not sure we have a definite answer yet anyway, but it'd be very interesting to know when we realize that we do it and also other people do it. But I guess my question to you is, what are the stories that you tell yourself? When have you kind of realized that that was happening? Are you trying to edit some of that inner dialogue? What do you make of it? And any tips for anyone in the audience wondering about that?
I can start with tips for sure. I think we all have a negative script running at some point in our lives, in our minds. I think I don't know the science behind it, but I do think that we are wired to, I think maybe it's a sense of protection to look out for things that on the horizon that might affect us negatively in some way. So we can tend to run through the negative scenarios first. But I read that our brain can only really focus on 3 to 4 things. Our conscious mind can only really take in 3 to 4 things at the same time. And if you think about the amount of things that we see every day, I mean, it doesn't matter where you live, especially in London, how many adverts you see on the way to work, or how many conversations you might overhear, or people that you see. We almost need to do something called a future script exercise, which I found really exciting. I learned about it a few years ago. And the method is simply that you take a pen and paper and you write down how it's going to go. So think of a scenario in your mind. We might have taken this discussion today, like if you're ever on a webinar or you're pitching, sit down and write how it's going to go as if it's happened already. So write it past tense. So absolutely nailed that pitch today. Like everybody in the room absolutely loved it. I could see the expressions on their faces. Here's the types of things you might have heard afterwards, everybody said they were so inspired by our story. Our brains are hooked on being right.
Yes.
We can so easily manipulate our own brain. So by writing a future script, we're telling our brain to look out for those things. So let's say that you're stood doing a pitch and somebody frowns. It could be judgment. It could also be intense concentration because they're really hooked on what you're saying. You don't really know when you're on stage.
Or they have a fly on their nose.
Or they've got a fly on their nose, exactly.
Their kid is.
But if we've written down first the type of thing we want to be reading, we might automatically go and read, oh, they're really concentrating, rather than, oh, are they judging me? So I think, and it sounds like a funny exercise, but we've done it in teams as well, like 3 things that you'd like to make happen. It's amazing how quickly you can make things happen when you tell your brain they've happened already.
Absolutely.
In fact, I like to put it in a little envelope and seal it and come back to it 3 months later and read it. And it's usually more accurate than you can think it will be.
We should all do that today. Like right after this,
yes,
you are in a good vibe, having like you're in your good place. I would actually encourage people to stand up and do it, like just changing where your body is when you're writing or when you're having an idea. So yeah, that's the call to action, folks. and then share it back with KTN, because I think it'd be really cool to just see what people, well, maybe we'll do a reminder in like a couple months. So I know I'm going to do that. I would say there's back to that individual personal story and then the narrative collective one. I think in that future script, we can really craft out what we want that story to look like for us. I think the bigger challenge that just requires humans getting together is, how do we craft a shared narrative? And again, this is something we think about a lot at Purpose when we're talking about how do we build collective movements, how do we support movements already underway, how do we help people not just strategize, but really understand what is the current that you want to ignite or supercharge. And I think with those negative stories we tell ourselves, like there's a negative collective psyche that is actually super dangerous when we talk about misinformation, disinformation, hate speech. I mean, these are all things that don't just happen because of one message or one person. So I like to think about, there's the individual one, and then where do I sit vis-a-vis my own communities? How am I helping, craft narratives that are not just helpful, but actually thriving narratives? And I would say this to like folks who are in the innovator space. I won't call out just particularly women, but I think when we're talking about, various genders, various races, there is an element of like, we immediately go to imposter syndrome. And the story we tell ourselves is, I shouldn't be here. Like, I'm not good enough, or they're going to find out. That is true to a certain extent on personal, individual level thinking, but I'm maybe going to be a bit provocative. There was an article, I think it was by Harvard Business Review, and it was like, stop telling women they have imposter syndrome when the environment is really harmful. And I was like mind blown. Again, not always the case, but when the environments themselves are not helping people receive these stories or actually creating a narrative that is ready for people to thrive, why are we penalizing the individual? Like, this is like public health. Like, we do not do that. You do not, it's not an individual issue if the environment you're sending people back to is like making them sick. So I do want to just sort of warn us, because we do a lot of self, like the self needs to be doing this work. And that's a narrative. Like, you need to fix yourself. Like, no, the environment's really awful. Let's like fix that first. So yeah, I'm just going on a tangent, but I think this is, again, the art and science piece. Like, there are systems at play, and there are levers that we can actually leverage that will have so much more impact than any individual part of the system. And while like that is daunting of a narrative, that's not the narrative that is easy to tell. It's not the narrative that's easy to digest. I would actually say, when we name that narrative, then the individual stuff can come out. And I'll just give a tip, because I've just given you like a lot of things to digest. The individual can navigate, I think, more effectively with care when the systems piece is understood. So for instance, my grandfather, my mother's side, like he was a pianist or accordion player, but he said he would even get nervous at church when he would have to pray or lead the congregation. So he would just raise his hands. And he said, I'm not doing this to invoke, a higher power. I'm doing this because I'm so nervous. And this room is actually full of people we don't always agree. But like, me doing that is actually saying, I'm not an imposter. I am so here. Like, I'm here to navigate. So there are hacks we can do at individual level, but we shouldn't do them without naming the system barriers that are there. So that's just 2 cents for me. I think we could talk about imposter syndrome offline, but there's a lot of space for that. There's a lot of neuroscience work behind it as well. So I'm not discrediting it, but I think we take that often in isolation from the systems issues at play.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just to touch slightly on that, I think with regards to environment and culture at workplaces as well, 64 Million Artists, they work on co-creating safe spaces for people to tell their story and understand where they fit in a workspace or a community. And I think listening is such a huge part of storytelling. Like, it's really important for businesses to be listening to their employees and their teams, and understand, like, it's really so important for them to all understand who's coming from where, what kind of experience are you living, and how do we hear that in a way that's active, so that we can build a narrative that's real at our workplace and our community, and it's not just assumed. You know, I think bottom-up storytelling and co-creating those with people that are part of the story is a big importance there.
Totally. Yeah.
You're so right. And on that individual level, which is where we started as well, this discussion, to be able to listen to ourselves first is the first step, right? To then think about, are these the stories that I want to be telling myself? Would I tell these stories to a friend? Would I tell these stories to a family member? And what is the impact that what I'm telling myself, what is the impact that that's having on my own mental health, on my own well-being, but then beyond that, on the connections that I make with people, on the impact that I have in the world, and on contributing to then that collective story that you touched on, Karina. There's this wonderful book, I don't know if you've read it, I'm listening to the audio version at the moment. It's called Humankind by Rutger Bregman. I probably say it terribly wrong, but it's really challenging those collective perceptions of, we can't trust one another, or going with the fear first, because that protected us for hundreds of years. We needed to be more reactive to a spider that is probably going to kill us than someone who's trying to help us, right? So we have that tendency to get hooked on those negative stories that don't necessarily serve us in the modern life that we are evolving in currently. Again, that's a bit like touchy territory, because like Karina said, there are some environments that are toxic. So there's so much to unpack there. I feel like we could have another hour on this. Yeah. Unfortunately, we don't. So I'm going to have to ask a final question. Where do I take it? Well, I know where I want to take it. Can stories change the world? That's the real question that I have for you. I think it's a very big one, but I just want to hear your take on it. Can stories really change things? And especially, I'd love to take a diversity and inclusion lens on it. We obviously are doing a lot of work, which is incredible, in this space in the UK, I would say. Obviously, you've heard my accent by now, so you probably guessed that was French. I didn't mention that. Did I mention that? Maybe I should have mentioned that. But so I suppose looking at it from that perspective, I think the UK is at the forefront of a lot of these topics around diversity and inclusion. And stories are a big part of how we're trying to move the needle. Is it enough? Are stories enough to change the world? Are stories enough to make it more inclusive? And if yes, how so? And if no, what else do we need?
I don't think stories are enough on their own, personally. I feel like we need good people and good values and ethics first. And we need stories to understand where we are currently. And then to change things, we need to know where we're going. We need like Karina said, strategy and a plan. And we need to care and understand what people need. And from that, we can tell the story that will help inspire people to join and rally people and get them passionate about the cause that you're trying to lead. We were actually, the three of us were discussing Abercrombie and Fitch just last week. I don't know if anyone's seen their documentary White Hot, but that is a great example of a brand being built on exclusion and discrimination. It was baked in from day one. And so that is a case of where storytelling alone wasn't enough. At some point, bad ethics and bad values are going to come and get you. So I don't believe that story is enough, because it works the other way around as well. It's no point in telling everybody that your brand is amazing and that it's well sourced. Everybody cares so much about where their clothes come from, where their food comes from, and at some point it's going to catch up with you. So I believe that it's really important to have good values first, and then find people that can help you tell that story and reach everybody, because there's so many great businesses out there now. We've got like zebras versus unicorns, and zebras are the businesses that are balancing purpose with profit. And I'm really keen to hear more of those stories being told, like, what is your purpose? And I think that they're stronger businesses at the end of it and they'll last for longer.
Yeah.
You know?
Oof, that's a lot for us to. I would agree. I would think, actually, I think there's some caveats of whether stories can change things. I think, again, collective level, and then I'll say something about the individual, because I think that's where we can all start doing things today. Collectively, I think stories could change things, particularly for D&I. I would say if we do not talk about power and if we do not talk about equity, those stories don't move very far. And I can say, experiencing this in and out, we do have a lot of stories where it's great to embrace different perspectives. I think an inclusive space has to be the baseline. Like, that's not what we're aiming for. That's where we should be starting from, because only in building an inclusive space, but to do that, we do need to talk about equity. And equity is like, we're not all starting from the same spot. And when we talk about power, we're actually saying we're going to actively acknowledge that. And we're going to do that with care and authenticity. And I often see equity completely being taken out of these stories. So then people get upset or worried. They're like, oh, wait, I'm going to have to shift, or I'm going to have to not be the one speaking, or wait, actually, there might be other perspectives that have been historically not here. So again, this is not like pointing fingers that people need to fix it, but I think if we don't even have that as a core part of the story, then the challenge becomes, how do we tell stories about the systems themselves that actually resonate with people? Because I know myself, like the system story, even situating yourself in the system narrative when you weren't even written into it in the first place is really daunting and actually quite depressing. So that's where it leaves me with the individual. I think when you have those moments to do that, like remembering your own story in those moments of like doubt. And this is not I saw some movement in the chat about imposter syndrome. It's definitely not about confidence, but there are ways that we behave when we're in systems that are not set up for us, which that to me is where your own individual story, like what I started off with about my grandmother's, I'm always nervous when I play. I'm nervous when I sing. I'm nervous when I dance. And like, that has not gone away, since I was a child, but there is an element of getting better now of like, no, my grandmother couldn't leave. I get to do this. If I'm nervous, I'm doing it because, I owe it to her. like those are the kind of things, the stories that I try to tell myself in those moments. So I think that absolutely has the power to change things. So yeah, I would just leave us with that. Or at least I'll leave what I'm saying with that. I think there's definitely opportunity, and I've seen it time and time again. So it's not that it hasn't been done.
Just a quick note on the nervousness, because I think that we all suffer from that in some area of our lives. I certainly do. I get very nervous even before something like this, or even it can be a Zoom meeting with work. But I saw a study once about athletes and the fact that that everything that you experience when you're nervous is the same as when you're excited. There is no difference. We just tell ourselves that we're nervous rather than excited, because we might have that imposter syndrome or negative narrative built in. But if the next time you're feeling nervous, if you can just shift it and tell yourself that you're excited, even if it feels like a lie, just try it, because I find that sometimes that actually just switches it up a little bit.
I've also reframed the nerves into caring. If I'm nervous about something, it's because I want to add value. It's because I want to help someone. And so it's because I care. And so learning to, I suppose, love the emotion of anxiety for the sign that it's giving you, the message. Emotions are like messages in our body, and so bringing you that message that maybe you're excited and also maybe you care. So
Audrey has just said that it's an adrenaline rush that gives you the energy to perform doing what you love. And Audrey, I couldn't agree more. I think it also helps you focus like really deeply on what it is you're about to do. So Embrace the nerves. We're human.
Exactly, embrace the nerves. Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I think to wrap up that that question around stories, you know, what I'm hearing is that stories are indeed really powerful. There's so much power in them, and having said that, they can divide or connect us. So there needs to be that value, that purpose piece, and how we're going to use that story and for what. But also then there needs to be that call to action. Imagine the difference between if Martin Luther King had said, I had an idea versus I have a dream. So just leaving with that and the importance and the power of stories when it leads and it's ingrained in the action as well. Veronica, it's back to you for the close. Just bang on 11. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Karina and Sam. I've absolutely loved this conversation. I wish we had another hour or two or a day.
Me too. I really want to just go for dinner with you.
Yeah, let's do it. It needs to happen.
And with everyone attending as well. Thank you for attending so much.
Thank you so much. It has been such a great conversation. And I do believe in the power of stories as well. We are all story holders, story messengers, right? So Corina, I will definitely take from you, you know, what is the current that I personally want and need to ignite for the common good, you know, current being the narrative. So I will, that's something to reflect on. And thank you for your time. Just a quick note that we are going to organize 2 more sessions this year, part of the Let's Talk About webinar series, plus a new series titled Meet the Woman Innovator, designed to spotlight inspirational women innovators, amplify their voices, and debunk different stereotypes around there that, you know, I'm sure we are all aware of. So please keep an eye out on our social media, on our community newsletter, and we hope we will see you again soon to one of the sessions. And thank you so much, Sam, Corina, Solen, for such an amazing, authentic session, and to my colleague Chloe as well, our event manager behind the scenes, for making sure that everything is organized properly. Thank you so much to all of you as well for joining us today. We hope you will continue the conversation. Why not with us, with your friends, with your family? We do believe it's so important to talk about storytelling and to share our stories in a way that serves all of us for common good. So thank you so much, and see you again soon, and have a good day.
See you soon.
Thanks
so much.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.